Hello there. I see you're here. My name is Altalune, and I am your storyteller for today's Stories in the Dark. I hope you're ready for this one. I hope you don't get nightmares. And I hope you still get to sleep afterwards this story. So, are you ready? Flight 715 by Anthony Horowitz. There are some nightmares so horrible that even when you wake up, they won't quite go away. You lie in bed with the grey light of the morning beating at the window. And even though you're in your own bed, in your own room, you still wonder. Because the creatures of your dreams, the ghosts and monsters are still with you, hiding in the shadows, just out of sight. And maybe you lie there for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, thinking about it, wondering. But finally, you convince yourself you have to. It was only a dream. Judith Fletcher had just such a dream on the last day of her vacation in Canada, and even as her parents slept on in their room and her younger sister Maggie snored noisily in the bed next to her, she lay there and remembered. This was her dream. She was at a funeral. There was something wrong with the cemetery. It was far too big and the grass simply didn't look like grass. It was as flat as cardboard and the strange color that he only sees in dreams. A green, silver gray that had no name. There was a church bell ringing, and in the distance, a clock showing 3 minutes past 6. Judith didn't walk into the cemetery. She was carried, lifted by unseen hands. It was only as she floated towards a single grave, a black rectangle that seemed to have been cut out rather than dug, that she felt the first wave of terror. This wasn't any funeral. This was hers. She tried to wake up, but sleep had become a prison. She tried to scream, but only the faintest whisper escaped her lips. And then she saw the mourners. There were about 300 of them, standing around the grave, none of them speaking. Even though she was asleep, it struck her as curious that none of them had dressed for the funeral. They were wearing their everyday clothes, watching her with empty, blank faces. Most of them were carrying the suitcases. Some had duty-free bags. There was a fat woman with big eyes and a shock of curling hair. A little boy holding a teddy bear that was missing an arm. A sullen-faced husband and wife, holding hands, not talking to each other. A black man in a leather jacket, biting his fingernails. Later on, she would remember every one of them as if she had known them all her life. And even though she was certain she had never seen them before. And then there was the vicar. At least Judy assumed he was the vicar, as he seemed to be in charge. But at the same time, she was aware that the man wasn't wearing church clothes. Indeed, he seemed to be dressed in some sort of uniform. He was a thin man with long fair hair. His nose had been broken at some time and there was a thin scar running down his cheek. He was standing alone nearest the grave, and as Judith arrived, he said 4 words. Flight 715. The invisible hands lowered Judith into the grave. Darkness rushed in on her, and that was when the nightmare became unbearable. When she struggled with all of her being to break free. She couldn't breathe. She had never known such utter blackness. It seemed to be not just outside her, but inside too. At the back of her eyes and her throat, reaching to the pit of her stomach. She was falling into it, endlessly falling. The tiny rectangle of light that had been the entrance to the grave was now a mile away. At the same time, she was aware of 2 distinct sounds. First, a huge explosion, and then the scream of ambulances that grew louder and louder until she couldn't take any more. She woke up. She wasn't dead. She was alive and lying in a rented apartment in Vancouver. Her name was Judith Fletcher, and she was 13 years old. Her father, an architect, has been appointed to work on a new hotel complex in the city, and he had taken the opportunity to bring the whole family over to travel around Canada. That was where they had been for the past 3 weeks. And today, they were due to fly back to London on Flight 715. Judith got up, went into the bathroom and splashed cold water over her head. She looked into the mirror. 2 blue eyes set in a round freckled face with fair hair hanging long on each side. Looked back. In the bedroom, she heard Maggie wake up and call out for her. That was Maggie through and through. The only time her 8-year-old sister ever stopped talking was when she was asleep. But Judith ignored her. Yeah, she had to think. She knew it had just been a dream. A horrible dream. But at the same time, she was certain that it was something more. It had all been so real. She had dreamed before, but never such in detail. And no dream had stayed with her the way that this one had. She could still remember everything, and even as the water trickled down her cheeks and dripped off her chin, she realized that this dream had one other difference too. She knew what it meant. It couldn't have been simpler. She was going to die at 3 minutes past 6. There was a time she had seen on the clock. She even knew how she was going to die. The Vicar, who wasn't a Vicar, had told her. Flight 715. The plane was going to crash. Judith wasn't superstitious. She didn't believe in ghosts, witches, UFOs, telepathy, or any of the other things that the boys at school were always talking about. She had watched 1 or 2 episodes of The X-Files, but the stories hadn't interested her simply because she couldn't take them seriously. Just because something couldn't be explained, that didn't make it supernatural. There was no such thing as the supernatural. That was what she had always thought. Until now. Now she remembered. There was a word for what she had experienced. Clairvoyance. There were people who dreamed things that were going to happen. Things that did happen. They were called clairvoyants. And they weren't all weirdos either. Judith's history teacher had once said that Joan of Arc was a clairvoyant. So was the American President Abraham Lincoln, who had actually dreamt of his own assassination a week before it happened. A writer, Mark Twain, had dreamed of the death of his brother. There was even some guy who had described the sinking of the Titanic in every detail. 14 years before it had happened. The dream had changed everything, because she knew in her heart that it hadn't simply been a dream. It had been altogether more frightening. A warning. It didn't matter what she believed or what she didn't believe. She couldn't ignore what she had seen. She left the bathroom and went back into her bedroom to get dressed. Sweatshirt, jeans, sneakers, and a baseball cap. Her parents were also awake and had quickly fallen into the chaos of last-minute packing. Where are the tickets? She heard her dad call out from the other bedroom. By the bed, that was her mom, Sandra Fletcher, worked as a hospital administrator. She had taken unpaid leave in order to make the trip. And in a few hours' time, the 4 of them would be boarding a plane, Flight 715 to London, and they would all die. At 3 minutes past 6, the plane was due to land at 6:15 in the morning, and something would go horribly wrong. And, do you want some breakfast, girls? Mark Fletcher had poked his head through the door, breaking off Judith's thoughts. He was a fit, athletic man in his early 40s, just a few streaks of gray in his hair. "I'm starving." Maggie was standing on her bed. Now she began to jump up and down, her pigtails a-flying. She excited about the flight, Judith thought. The flight. She said nothing while Sandra served up their last Canadian breakfast. Waffles and crisped up bacon with maple syrup. There were cases everywhere. The family had taken so much luggage with them that they had almost had extra charged at Heathrow, and since then they've added more than a few pounds of souvenirs, clothes, and ever since the girls had found they were half price in Canada, rollerblades and CDs. Her mother pushed a plate in front of her, but she ignored it. She had been frightened by what had happened, but she was almost as frightened as the thought of what she now had to do. "What's the matter, Judith?" Mark Fletcher had noticed a look on his daughter's face. "I'm not going home." And there it was. She'd done it, said it. As easy as that. Mark laughed. "Thinking about school, are you?" "Vacations have to end sometime, Judith," her mother said. "No." Judith's face was almost expressionless. "I'm not going on the plane." Her parents exchanged a look, a little puzzled now. "What do you mean?" her father asked. "She's scared." Maggie giggled and dipped her finger into the maple syrup, drawing a circle on her plate. "The plane's going to crash," Judith said. "I'm not going on it. None of us are." Sandra had been holding a mug of coffee. She put it down. "What are you talking about, darling?" she said. She sounded so reasonable, but Judith knew she wouldn't be that way for long. "You'd never been scared of flying." "I am not scared. I mean, I'm not scared of flying, but I'm not going on that flight 715. Mark smiled, still trying not to take his daughter too seriously. "We can't change the tickets," he said. "You know that. We can buy new ones." "Do you have any idea how much that would cost?" "There's no question of buying new tickets," Sandra explained. "What is all this, Judith? Why are you being so silly?" "I'm not being silly." She had to tell them, even though she knew what they would say. "I had a dream." "A dream?" Her mother relaxed. Judith saw she was relieved. A dream was something she could handle. It was something she understood. "We all have bad dreams," she said. "It's only natural." Mark took over from his wife. "It's a long flight, uncomfortable. Airline food. Yuck." That was Maggie's contribution. "Nobody enjoys flying," Mark went on. "But just because you had a bad dream about something doesn't mean anything's going to happen." Judith felt a sudden sadness. She had never known her parents to be so predictable. It wasn't an ordinary dream, she said. It was different. I was in a cemetery. We don't really need to hear about it, Sandra interrupted. She was a little bit angry now, and somehow that was predictable too. For heaven's sake! You're 13 years old now, Judith. You know what dreams are. You'll have forgotten it before we get to the airport, Mark said. I'm not going to the airport. Mark and Sandra looked at each other again, suddenly helpless. Judith knew what they must be thinking. She had never behaved this way before. She had never felt this way either. Even now, sitting with her breakfast in front of her and suitcases everywhere, everything so normal. She even felt as if she were only half there. The other half was still trapped in the dream. And she knew. That was the worst of it. She knew with cold certainty that she was right. But that there was nothing she could do or say that would persuade him. Judith had never been more alone. Her father tried another approach. Humor her. Reason with her. And if that doesn't work, get angry with her. Practical Parents for Difficult Daughters, Chapter 3. This is ridiculous, Judith. Nothing's going to happen to the plane. You're just upsetting Maggie. Anyway, there's no point arguing about it. We're leaving on flight 715 at midday. If you're really so childish that you're going to let a dream upset you, that's your problem. But what if I'm right, Dad? Judith knew it was hopeless, but she had to try one last time. What if it wasn't a dream? What if it was something more? You don't believe that nonsense. You never believed it. You've been watching too much television. You know, Judith, this is so stupid. And it was the last line, the scorn and the superiority in her father's voice that convinced her. She had known what she was going to do almost from the moment she had left the bathroom, but she had been unsure whether she would have the strength to do it. Now she acted without thinking. Suddenly she stood up. Then before anyone could stop her, she pushed away from the table, jumped over one of the suitcases, and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Judith? Her father called out. But even if he had guessed what Judith was planning, it was already too late. Judith ran across the hall, her heart thudding so hard it made her ears ring. Without stopping, she reached the front door. It wasn't locked. Her hand was trembling as she turned the handle and opened it. And then she was out in the warm sunshine, running across the lawn onto the pavement. The sidewalk? That's what they call it in Canada? It was a crazy thought. But it was all crazy. She was crazy. That's that was what her parents would think before they murdered her. She would worry about that later. The apartment was on Robson Street in one of the busiest parts of Vancouver. In less than a minute, Judith had been swallowed up by the crowd mourning commuters. Even if her parents had realized what she had done and followed her out, they would never find her. She had been around the city only the day before and she knew where she was going. She made her way down to the waterfront and found a snack bar with a view across the lake to the Burrard Inlet with mountains and pine trees behind. She had $10 in her pocket, enough for a few drinks, enough to allow her to stay as long as she needed. Judith Fletcher eased herself into a plastic chair, pulled her baseball cap down her eyes, hiding himself from the world, and prepared to wait until the flight has left. Her parents, of course, were furious when she slunk back to the apartment just before midday. She had never seen them so angry. Their anger almost made them ugly, twisting their faces, burning in their eyes. How could you do this? We've been looking everywhere for you. We've been worried sick about you. A young girl out in the city on her own. Do you know how much this is going to cost us? Were you out of your mind? When we get back to England, you are going to pay for this young lady. I don't know how, but you're going to pay. Her father had never smacked her, not once in her entire life. This time, Judith knew he had come close. Perhaps if she had been a boy, it would have been easier. A quick whack with a slipper and the tension would have been released. Instead, her parents' anger slowly wore itself out and the rest of the day was spent in a silence as flat and as unforgiving as the cemetery of her dream. Mark Fletcher made a telephone call and managed to persuade the airline to take them. That at least helped. The bags remained unpacked. Mark worked. Sandra went for a walk, bought a takeout lunch for them all. Judith didn't eat and killed time. The afternoon crept slowly on. Maggie watched television, then went out for a walk with her father. Sandra wrote a letter. Judith spent most of the time sitting by herself. She was ignored by everyone. Her parents were sullen. Maggie seemed completely baffled, as if her big sister had been taken over by someone else. And all the time Judith thought about Flight 715. Where was it now? Crossing the Arctic Circle? Dipping south over the Atlantic? The strange thing was, even now she had no doubts. The plane was due to land at 10 o'clock Canadian time, and she still knew with a horrid, cold certainty that at that moment her parents would understand. The plane would crash. The dream had told her as much. The thought of the passengers, all of them will die. She could almost see the far ball of flame, hear the ambulances tearing across the runway as she heard him that morning in bed. Now she was guilty. Shouldn't she have warned him to? Couldn't she stop the plane from taking off? No. She forced the thoughts out of her mind. She couldn't have done more than she had done. The rest was out of her control. But at 10:15, her parents would understand, and they would forgive her. Everything will be all right. At 10:05, her father got up and left the room. Maggie was already in bed, but Mark and Sandra hadn't said a word to the other daughter, and she knew that they had allowed her to stay up on purpose, that they wanted her to be with them now. Mark made the call from the hallway. Again, he didn't say what he was doing, but Judith knew he was calling England. She heard her father's voice, a low murmur on the other side of the door. Sandra was reading a paperback novel she had bought from the journey home. She flicked a page. There was a rattle, the sound of the telephone receiver being replaced. Mark Fletcher came back into the room. He stood in the doorway. Judith waited for him to speak, and at last the words came. Flight 715 landed at Heathrow 15 minutes ago. It was ahead of schedule. Now I'm going to bed. Judith never knew, nor did her parents. None of them ever found out, because they weren't at Heathrow. They didn't see the passengers come off the plane. There were about 300 of them. Apart from the Fletcher's own empty seats, it had been a full flight. The first person off the flight was a fat woman with large eyes and a shock of yellow hair. Then a young boy holding a teddy bear that was missing an arm. His parents was right behind him. A sullen-faced husband and a wife holding hands, not talking to each other. They were followed by a black man in a leather jacket. He was biting his fingernails. And so it went on. The last person of the plane was the pilot. He was a thin man with long, untidy hair. Years ago, he had been injured in a motorbike accident. There was a scar on his cheek, and he had broken his nose. As he left the plane, he was looking tired and sick. His face was pale. He had been sweating. His shirt was still damp, sticking to his chest. There were 3 officials waiting for him. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. The pilot shook his head and said nothing. But an hour later he told his story. The official sat up opposite him across a long table, taking notes. "It was the plumbing system," he said. "It must have sprung a leak. God knows how many gallons of water there were swirling around down there. And then, of course, with altitude it froze. Ice is heavier than water. I don't need to tell you that. And it was heavy. I knew something was wrong. The way the plane was handling. But it was only when the flight attendant told me that they couldn't flush the toilets and the economy..." He smiled, but there was no humor in his face. Anyway, by then it was too late. There was nothing I could do. As you know, I radioed ahead, got all the emergency vehicles waiting. I could just about fly, but I wasn't sure I could land. Not with all that weight. It was a full flight. The pilot had opened a can of Coke. He drank it all in one gulp. To tell you the truth, he went on, if there had been one extra ham sandwich on that plane, I don't think we'd have made it. You were lucky, one of the officials said. You're right. I heard that there was a no-show at the last minute. A family of 4 and a ton of luggage. Why were they on the plane? The officials asked. The 2 other officials shook their heads. I have no idea, the pilot said. But I'm glad they weren't. Because I'm telling you, I'm not exaggerating. If they'd been on that flight, and we'd had extra weight on board, he crumpled up the can and looked at it for a moment, laying the palm on his hand. None of us would be here now, he said. They saved us. He threw the can into a waste paper basket and quietly left the room. The end. So there you have it. I hope all of you will sleep soundly tonight. Dream less, I hope. Imagining having a dream like that. A dream foretelling your future demise. Will you be like Judith Fletcher? What will you do? Anyway, until next time, until the next stories in the dark.